Hi, I'm Kyle Hunter. My research question is, how are African Americans being targeted by law enforcement in the United States within the past 5 years? About 10 years ago or so, African Americans and law enforcement didn't have many problems with each other, but within the past 5 years, tensions between them have grown tremendously, with police shootings of unarmed blacks to blacks firing back at the police. Tensions between law enforcement and African Americans has been shaky throughout history, but back in the 1960s, it was at what some would call an all-time high. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a black civil rights activist in the mid-1950s to his death in 1968, said, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality." African Americans being targeted and discriminated is a problem because all people are equal. But with law enforcement targeting African Americans, how blacks respond, and how media portrays blacks as criminals, people are starting to question that statement. This is an ongoing issue from America's past. Ever since the United States was established, blacks have been seen to be lesser than whites because they were slaves. But even after the 14th Amendment was passed and slaves were granted citizenship, they were still discriminated by many, especially whites in the South. Up until 1964, when Jim Crow laws were abolished, blacks weren't allowed to drink from the same water fountain, attend the same school, or use the same bathroom as whites, as well as many other things. Jim Crow laws are segregation and disenfranchisement laws that label blacks as separate but equal to whites. Although they are gone, people still feel the effects of them today. On August 9, 2014, in Ferguson, Missouri, an unarmed 18-year-old African American named Michael Brown was shot and killed by Darren Wilson, a white 28-year-old police officer. Wilson engaged with Brown and his friend Dorian Johnson because they were suspected to have taken part in a strong-arm robbery of a convenience store. Brown's death sparked many protests in Ferguson and surrounding cities where protesters shouted, "Hands up, don't shoot," because according to Brown's friend Dorian, Brown was surrendered with his hands up to Wilson, but he was still shot 4 times in the right arm and twice in the head, with the fatal shot hitting the top of his head and entering his skull. This isn't the only account of a police officer shooting an unarmed African American man. "Do you have your license on you?" is what Ray Tenzing, a white University of Cincinnati police officer, asked Samuel DuBose, a 43-year-old African American, on July 19, 2015, the date of DuBose's death. Tenzing pulled over DuBose for failure to display a front license plate. Tenzing's body cam recorded the whole incident. The footage shows DuBose driving off and Tenzing firing his gun at him as he drove off. The result of the incident ended with DuBose's death and Tenzing having 2 mistrials. Yet another incident involves Alton Sterling, a 34-year-old African American known for selling CDs. He was doing his usual CD selling in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, when 2 white officers, Howie Lake II and Blaine Salamone, came to the convenience store parking lot on reports that a man in a red shirt was selling CDs, and that he used a gun to threaten a man. The description fit Sterling's outfit that night. The incident between Sterling and the 2 officers was recorded by several bystanders and security cameras at the store. At first, the cops tased Sterling because he was resisting. Then eventually they had him pinned to the ground. After having Sterling on the ground, one of the cops yelled that he had a gun. Then Officer Salamone believed he was going for the gun, and 3 gunshots were heard. The camera moved away from the scene, and another 3 shots were heard. After this, Sterling had died. Neither officer on the scene had federal charges against them, but state charges are still pending. These shootings and others have sparked many Black Lives Matter protests in several large cities. However, these protests are supposed to be peaceful, but in Dallas, a sniper opened fire and shot 5 officers from a rooftop. This made African Americans look more like criminals, which makes more people dislike them, proving that a house divided cannot stand. The targeting of African Americans and cops could be resolved with 3 solutions. The media could stop making African Americans look like criminals, the government could implement tests for law enforcement, and the government could sanction stop and frisk policies. In a paper published in the Journal of Communication, Travis Dixon, a University of Michigan professor, and Daniel Lentz, a UC Santa Barbara professor, sampled local news broadcasts in Los Angeles and Orange counties in California and found that African Americans were overrepresented as perpetrators and Latinos and whites were underrepresented as perpetrators. This study sparked the hashtag #IfTheyGunMeDown, where African Americans posted pictures of themselves looking nice and posted another of them looking like a quote-unquote thug. This solution is difficult due to the First Amendment, the freedom of the press. This amendment was passed in 1791, only 15 years after the birth of the United States, along with 9 other amendments, so this amendment isn't going anywhere. Another solution is to have law enforcement take a test every year on how to act when being involved in a petty crime. Most incidents, such as the Sam DuBose shooting, are a result of officers letting the situation get out of hand. According to Alice Goffman, a sociologist, urban ethnographer, and visiting assistant professor of sociology at Pomona College, many African Americans grow up without their role models because they have been arrested for a petty crime. With the implementation of the test, young African Americans would grow up with their role models, stay out of trouble, and receive a good education. To implement these tests, however, police departments would have to spend lots of money to have the tests prepared and distributed to their officers every year. Bill Nunley, a former police chief in Damascus, Virginia, resigned his position due to increasingly shrinking resources. Small departments such as the one in Damascus may enter debt or have to downsize due to dwindling funds. The best solution to solving the violence is to stop enforcing stop-and-frisk policies. These policies allow police officers to stop someone just because they are suspicious of them. Many officers abuse this authority. Charles Epp and Stephen Maynard Moody, professors at Kansas University who specialize in public affairs and racial discrimination, said in their article Driving While Black, many officers under this policy stop people usually without evidence that they have committed a crime. Writing of this would have prevented the shootings of Michael Brown and Samuel DuBose. To implement this solution, however, it takes lots of time for these policies to be appealed because it would have to go through many courts and political levels. Police discrimination has been around for a long time. The best way to end this is to rid of stop-and-frisk laws. Ending these would prevent many cases of police brutality and would lower tensions between blacks and whites. Us citizens need to not let those of power abuse their authority and target those who are weaker and more vulnerable.
What evidence did you gather that you didn't use? Why did you choose not to use it?
A piece of evidence I gathered and chose not to use was a quote by Malcolm X, and I chose not to use it because most protests today are supposed to be peaceful, and Malcolm X liked to use force to get his point across.
What advice would you have for other researchers who consider this topic?
A piece of advice I would give a researcher researching this topic would to be make sure all of your evidence and examples of your police brutality are around the same time.